What I'm going to do in the second part of the class tonight is we're going to move on through the various chapters of James White's books. And I'm going to spend some of these slides we're going to fly through because I don't think that they're as significant. But we talked a little bit about the different kinds of biological transfer, the prodigal and then conversion growth. And obviously what most churches are lacking is the actual conversion growth. And so we want to ask, why? And the unfinished car, that was his making cars, is the idea that we're creating Christians that don't really have a function in the world. And so the two foundational challenges, and I certainly agree with this. The first is churches have got to die to self, and this is a hard one. But the idea that of the amount of resources that we spend on our own needs is clearly disproportionate to the mission that we've been called to. So the second part is that we have to then embrace the difficult task of targeting. And in a lot of churches, both of these would be almost unchangeable challenges. So knowing how to, the idea, first of all, that the church is not about us. We are the mission of God to the world. The church is about reaching the lost. That's the purpose of it. And that's where we find our true meaning, is in that purpose. And then recognize that it would be nice if we could just quit being self-focused and everything would happen, naturally after that. But trying to reach non-believers who are unchurched and have no desire. I mean, he said it's not like trying to convince someone to take a Delta flight instead of United Airways flight. Both ways they're going to fly and they're getting on an airplane. And if you're just trying to change the version, then maybe you can say Delta has a few more perks. You're talking about a person who refuses to get on the airplane, and you're trying to get them there. And that's a different challenge. So he talks about this CarMax model where he hated buying cars until he found, and the way that, and it's true, those of you who know the business model of CarMax, they went around and interviewed a significant number of people and said, why do you hate buying a car? And everyone told them why, and they said, okay, we're not going to do that. And so I don't know, I've not bought a car there, so I'm just accepting that that's a good experience. Anybody want to validate that one? I do hate the experience of buying a car. So I leave it to my wife, who is ruthless. She is, woo, man, last time we walked out of a car dealership, she was dragging the dealer who was hanging onto her heel as she said, let go of me, you heathen. Anyway, she's good. I'm not. I'm a wimp.
I've bought several cars there, and sometimes I get frustrated because you can't argue with them.
Yeah, that's
You can't debate about it.
Yeah,
just what it
And
is.
you just can't please anybody. All right, moving on. This is, again, the huge presupposition that most of his methodology is based on. And understand, I'm not discounting the value of this book. I like it. I'm just saying recognize that what he is committed to is that his church is going to be what's going to attract nuns. And there may be a better way of reaching them. We're just trying to consider that. So his next chapter, if you build it, they won't come. And this is based on the seeker model. There used to be if you prepare the right environment and open the doors, people will come. And basically he says it's no longer a matter of creating an inviting environment, that safe place for dangerous message, which was the seeker service methodology. It's based on the flawed premise that people want what we have to offer. Okay, so that you can't base marketing on the fact that you have a product that everybody wants unless you tell them why they want it. And so churches, I tell you, this is where I think for a long time, I wrote about this way back in the 70s, that we become so ingrown that we sit around thinking up ideas that make our spiritual tails wag, but nobody else gets it. I mean, when you think about, like, for instance, gospel meeting, does anyone even remember this? I still know churches that do that every year, and what they say is the world is no longer interested in the gospel because they don't come. And the truth is the members don't come either. And so it's a loss of spirituality. No, it's a changed world. There was actually a time on the frontier when a gospel meeting was the event of the year. Of course people came. But now what are you competing against? Everything, right? And so it's a different world. And so that, assuming that people want what we have because we're satisfied with it is a lethal assumption. Drew? Or true?
Also, like the
for me to say at my house, back in Seattle, say like, there used to be a core group of young people that were there, you know.
Yeah.
There was familiarity. It's like you don't have the same attitude about it because you know who's going to be there.
Yeah.
You already have a relationship with them.
Yeah.
And so they're not really saying anything new. So I'd rather go to the Seahawks game.
Sure.
I'd rather go to the Seahawks game. You know.
Yep. And so what White points out, and this is a really significant point, he says we've got to rethink the evangelism continuum. He didn't use the word continuum, I did. But he talks about in terms of 1 to 10, that it's a whole different thing to convert people from an 8 to a 10 than it is to convert people from a 3 to a 10. And that you make certain presuppositions about the 8 to 10, meaning all we have to do is to tell them we've got a better flavor of ice cream. They're coming to the ice cream shop anyway, and we offer it for less price, or we make it more comfortable. We have more trappings or whatever. They're already going to be here, so let's just convince them we have a better product. Well, that's certainly not where the world is. And so recognizing that is significant. So now he talks about these different ways of approaching the nones. So you can have those that are hostile to the NONEs, S's, those who are indifferent, those who are insensitive, those who target it, and then you have the no man's land, the idea that you're just enough on the edge that the nones really aren't interested, but you've offended all the faithful. And so, those, I guess, are helpful categories. I think his point is that there are churches that absolutely have no place for those who are not believers, and they don't want them there. What he's trying to convince us of is that we need to actually reach out intentionally to those who are non-believers. And I agree. But all these assume the idea of the weekend service as being the main way of reaching them. My presupposition is a different one. And it's what I call the idea of comparative stories. And I don't know and I think you can do this with weekend service. I'm not suggesting you can't. Was that okay? That what I have found to be true is that people are, if you have the opportunity to work with a person long enough, in my experience, this has been really effective, is just having people tell you what they value. Now, obviously, this takes a certain level of relationship, but just asking them what makes their world work and what they wake up to, and then just say, let me explain to you the story that is really meaningful to me and how I think it might give you an opportunity for a more meaningful life. At spring break this year, I'm not going to Dundee, Scotland to do what I normally do, and I had the opportunity. I'm thrilled that Jason Pagel, who's one of the ministers at Harpeth Hills, is going to lead the group. And so I had a debriefing with him this morning in terms of how we approach the work there. And that experience has really revolutionized the way I think about evangelism. I've used that in a lot of other places now. But the opportunity we have, if I talked about this, we go into a school and they give us all their 12-year-olds. That would be our 6th graders. And they still have RE, which is religious education. And we have them about 30 students, 90 minutes at a time. And I take the group of students with me from Lipscomb that are specially prepared for this. But basically what we do is we play, get to know each other games, and then we ask them the question, who are your heroes? And they tell us their heroes. And then I get up and say, now you're going to laugh when I tell you this, and it's okay to laugh, but I want you to know that Jesus is my hero. And they laugh. And the idea in Scotland and the UK in general is not that they're irreligious. They just don't care. It has no effect on them. They're post-Christian pagan. And it's not like they're anti-Christian. It's just like, why would you believe in Jesus? I mean, that makes no sense to me. And so it's made fun of if you've ever watched BBC stuff, right? And so basically what we do is say, let me tell you my story, why this is important to me. And it's not like I have this radical conversion story, but it is where I found the thing that's most meaningful in my life is helping people find their place in God's theology of creation, that God creates us to benefit others, and that's where we flourish. And so I just ask them, how many of you want to be involved in rescuing others or helping others? Okay, I know, these are 12-year-olds. But without exception, they raise their hand. Why? Because I think we all innately have the image of God in us. We want to help other people. Why would we care? And they haven't yet been hardened at that age, right? And so then we ask them, say, look, this is why we're here. Now, we could be in Florida. And by the way, Dundee in March is not the place where you go to get a suntan. All right? I mean, there's been some really rough weather, not unlike what we're experiencing now here. And they're right on the North Sea, so the wind just cuts through you. I said, we could be on the beach in Florida like a lot of students, but we're not looking for pity. We're here because we believe in you. Look them right in the eyes. And I tell our students, whatever you do, you look them in the eye, and you let them know you care about them. Now, I'm not trying to make Scottish culture evil, but for the most part, they've never had anyone look them in the eye and say, I believe in you. That's just not the way they parent. Now, some of them have that, but a lot of them don't have any kind of meaningful relationship in their life that's supportive. And so we say, look, here's why we're here. We desperately want you to stay in school because the story we believe to be true is that God created you to make the world a better place, and we believe in you. And we're going to stay with you here. And what we think, and then I'll tell them why Jesus is important to me, and then the students that are with me tell their small groups, and they'll have 5 or 6 students, look them in the eye and say, this is why Jesus is my hero. Then what's been transformative to me is we ask these 12-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay, 12-year-olds, right? So what are they going to say? Policemen, firemen, astronauts. And but then you'll get some different answers. One of them said, I want to be an astrophysicist. I can't even spell that. And for some reason, the group that gathers around me are the little nerds. I don't even want to think about why. But then we ask them the question, well, how would that affect your life if Jesus were your hero? And I could write a book on their answers. It's the most transformative experience. Did I tell you about the little girl who didn't want to tell me what she wanted to be? Did I tell you the story? I don't want to say it again. She looked at me and she was real nervous, and she was sort of a little nerdy, that, like I said, the groups are self-selecting, so when I'm sitting there, I actually look for the ones who don't know where to go because they don't have a friend to sit with. They all trend up. So I just intentionally pull them over and sit them down. And this little girl was obviously not one of the in crowd. And she said, I don't want to tell you what I want to be because if I do, you'll laugh. And I said, no, I won't. I promise I won't. And if anyone else in our group laughs, I'll smack them. And I smiled. All right, so I wasn't going to really do it with the love of the Lord, of course. And so she said, well, when I grow up, I want to be a hairdresser. And I said, why would that make me laugh? And she said, because my friends tell me that's silly. That's only what people do that can't do anything else. And she said, but since I've been a little bitty girl, she said, I've taken the dolls that I have, and I see, she said, and their eyes brightened up. She said, I have a whole doll beauty parlor. And I looked over at the other kids with a warning eye because I could see them starting to snigger a little bit. Here is a 12-year-old who's still playing with her dolls, but to her, that was, you could tell. I mean, her creativity just, and she started talking about that, and I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, and I wrote it down almost word for word because I was so deeply moved by it. I said, if Jesus were your hero, what would that mean? And she thought about it for a minute. Here's a little 12-year-old girl who never heard the story of Jesus other than sort of make fun of it. But we talked about how it would turn you into a rescuer. And she said, I'd take God's beauty and make it even more beautiful. I think we know the story. We just haven't been given a chance to be creative in it. And then she said, and then she smiled and winked and said, it takes a person sitting in my chair. It takes them a while. And you know what I'd tell them? I'd say, you know what? Jesus is my hero. And I'll tell you why. Because they can't go anywhere. And she put her hands out like that. And then everyone laughed with her instead of at her. I just thought that was a profound moment. And so that's why I would say, I think it's hard from a pulpit to tell a story that is that personal. Now, I think you can certainly use that as an important part of the strategy. Please don't misunderstand me here. But what if we could prepare people to be able to share their story and tell people that there's a better story and ask them questions to let them know that we're as interested in their life as they might be in ours? So I'm just asking that. Now here we get, Perry, the idea of cause. This is really important. The idea that, they talk about in the 50s or whenever this was, the unchurched were brought to Christ that brought them to community. Then they wanted to be a part of a cause, right? And then in the 90s or whatever, you had the unchurched that when they became a part of community, then they met Christ and then they were interested in the cause. But now the nuns see a cause they'd like to be a part of, they meet a community, and then they come to Christ. And what this calls for makes us a little bit nervous because they can't be involved in the cause until they're at least a participant in the community. In other words, we invite them into the cause. Now, I have a good friend who preaches in a small community up in Indiana. I've told you about him before. He's done some amazing things. But one of the things they started doing as a church is building prefab buildings for a village in Honduras that they adopted the village. And they started having non-believers come and help them build these houses that they would then ship down in containers, and they would go down with a group of special construction workers and build houses. But they brought 2 or 3 deeply convicted atheists to faith through that cause. They wanted to help. Why? And that's where you have that opportunity to say, why do you care about people in Honduras? Why would you care? And are you familiar with the debate that went on between Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens when he was still alive? That Hitchens wrote the book "God Is Not Good," and this Doug Wilson, who was a preacher for a small, I don't remember, Presbyterian church up in Minnesota. But he took him on. He took on Christopher Hitchens. But it was fun because he showed Christopher Hitchens deep respect. And, Hitchens, if you're not familiar with him, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Really well-known guy. And he gets involved in this debate with this little podunk. Now, he was well-educated, but he's a Reformed theologian. And they started this debate via email about God is good. And so then they wrote a book together. It's a little book about, whether God is good or not. And it was so well received, they went on the road and did this series of debates. And they put together a video called Collision. And I would recommend you look at it. It's the only video I know of that doesn't stack the evidence. It's intentionally created to present both sides evenly. So Collision, it's a collision of ideas. Now, Doug Wilson, I think, is hampered by his Reformed theology. I think he would do much better if he didn't have to defend the idea of everything being predestined. Nonetheless, it's a really interesting example of dialogue with a non-believing person. And it's clear that Christopher Hitchens comes to really admire Doug Wilson, even though he categorically disagrees with him. And here's the kicker of the whole thing. Christopher Hitchens spent millions of his fortune on ending child slavery in various places in the world. And Doug Wilson would never let up in saying, "Why do you care?" In other words, there is this song I see in you that makes no sense in a survival of the fittest, which over and over again Hitchens says this is the way the world works. It's survival of the fittest. It's just evolutionary process. And so Doug Wilson would just keep asking him. They were going on the road and he'd say, "Hey, Christopher, why do you care? What do you care about this?" And finally, toward the end, Hitchens goes, "Doug, leave me alone. I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a clue as to why I care, but I know that I do." And Doug says, "Yeah, I know you do too, and I actually know why." We just have this deep desire within us. So this is why I think the idea of cause and community are also readily available in other places, and the cause of current churches is too often comfort of its own members. So these are the things that work against it. So it's not so much altering present culture, but in introducing a totally new reason. So what he goes on to say here is the current culture is not necessarily looking for these things unless we can provide them a better story. So let me get to this idea of the rhythms of the heart. This is my slide, by the way. This is not from the text. Where he talks about the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's a little bit weak in White's text in my view. Let me highly recommend, have any of you read Simply Christian? N.T. Wright? Okay, so you know the arguments here. Basically, what N.T. Wright does is he expands the good, the true, and the beautiful in a way that I have really found compelling. Okay, next time I see Tom Wright, I'm going to give him a bill because he's made me a poor man. I bought 40 copies of this book. Okay, 2 of them I gave to affirmed atheists that when they read the book, they have since come to faith. I think it's the best apologetic work of our time. I think it's better than Mere Christianity. And people disagree with that. Now, Mere Christianity had a huge impact on its particular environment, but as you know, some of the language and concepts are a bit antiquated, especially C.S. Lewis's view of women that comes across in that book that's not very helpful. So I'm hesitant to give someone Mere Christianity because it's written in 1947, and I think C.S. Lewis would write it differently today. But this book basically talks about the echoes of a voice, and what he suggests is that all of us have this deep awareness of a truth that if we vibrate the rhythms of this truth, this idea of a longing for justice, quest for spirituality, hunger for relationships. And here, I want to nuance that in just a moment. Delight in beauty. That what N.T. Wright is saying is basically these are things that people, there are still going to be those who aren't going to see this. But for the most part, he thinks this vibrates deep in the hearts of people. And if you can explore that, what they're hearing is echoes of a voice to which we have the opportunity to introduce them. This is the voice of Jesus. But unfortunately, we have churches that aren't necessarily longing for justice. We've lagged behind there. And we have churches that aren't necessarily deeply involved in meaningful life. And by the way, this is what James White and other surveys have shown, that there is an increase in the desire for spirituality over the 1990s and 1980s. People have a deep desire for spirituality. That's why there are so many odd spiritualities right now that are out there being marketed that make very little sense, but they have people who embrace them because people are looking for meaningful life, right? So, in this hunger for relationships, okay, I think Satan's got this one figured out, and that's why the virtual community is growing so rapidly. But there are studies showing that virtual community does nothing for true well-being, and that there's even this ambiguous thing about virtual relationships that may actually isolate people in ways and make people sort of unhealthy in ways that we've only begun to understand. And so you can be a part of a community without ever having interaction with another living human being in a visible way, in the actual touch, sight, sound, being actual in proximity. And there's some interesting studies that I think will come out in the next couple of years that will talk about that in terms of the difference between dealing with someone, separation anxiety you may have heard of, and some of the things that creates. So what Satan, I think, likes to do is he likes to provide opportunities for food that seems to satisfy, that leaves the heart unnourished. And so what N.T. Wright's really working on here is that we move from the Christian belief about God to living life in Jesus that's empowered by the Spirit. And then ultimately, what I wanted to read to you, I've read many other times, and you'll hear it more than once probably in this class, and I may have already read it, but the conclusion of Simply Christian. I really love the way he says this. He says, gradually we are glimpsing a truth which cannot be overemphasized. The task that awaits us as Christians, the paths we must walk, and the lessons we must learn are part of the great vocation which reaches us in God's Word, the Word of the Gospel, the Word of Jesus, and the Spirit. We are called to be part of God's new creation. We are called to be agents of that new creation here and now. And we are called to model and display that new creation in symphonies and family life, in restorative justice, in poetry, in holiness and service to the poor, in politics and in painting. And I have to stop here to say, this is where I would focus. I could be wrong, but I would focus the teaching aspect of the church on this idea. That as we come together around the table of our Lord, The point is to recalibrate our life into that story in such a way that as we leave that table, we take with us a story to tell. And it's told in all the multitudinous ways that are represented at the table. So you've got teachers and engineers and scientists and maintenance workers and stay-at-home moms, and they're all leaving with a message of renewal and new life in the specific context in which they find themselves. So that's what N.T. Wright's talking about. Here's my favorite part of this. He goes, when you see the dawn breaking, he's talking about new creation, you think back to the darkness in a new way. Sin is not simply the breaking of a law. It's missing an opportunity to live. Having heard the echoes of a voice, we are called to come and meet the speaker. We are invited to be transformed by the voice itself, the word of the gospel, the word which declares that evil has been judged, that the world has been put to rights, that heaven and earth are joined forever together, and that new creation has begun. And we are called to become people who can speak and live and paint and sing that word so that those who have heard its echoes can come and lend a hand in the larger project. That is the opportunity that stands before us as gift and possibility. Christian holiness is not about giving up something good. It's about growing up and grasping something infinitely better. Made for spirituality, we wallow in introspection. Made for joy, we settle for pleasure. Made for justice, we clamor for vengeance. Made for relationship, we insist on our own way, even if it costs those relationships most close to us. Made for beauty, we are satisfied with sentiment. But new creation has begun. The sun has begun to rise. Christians are called to leave behind in the tomb of Jesus all that belongs to the brokenness and incompleteness of the present world. It is time in the power of the Spirit to take up our proper role, our fully human role, as agents, heralds, and stewards of the new day that is dawning. That, quite simply, is what it means to be a Christian, to follow Jesus into the new world, God's new world, which He's thrown open before us. Okay. How do you react to that? It's not like many of you have heard this before, but his idea is that we become interpreters as agents of new creation in everything that we do so that we can help people recognize the echoes of the voice they hear is actually the voice of Jesus. Thoughts?
What if
reactions?
people are satisfied doing that apart from Christ?
That's why I think it's important to recognize, and this is, by the way, what Scott McKnight, when he comes in April, will be talking about, is we've got to come back to understanding that this is the purpose of the church, is to help people recognize that while they can participate in that apart from Jesus and feel good about it, it's exponentially increased in value when we understand that it has eternal implication. So instead of saying, well, what you're doing doesn't count, we say, well, what you're doing could even be more meaningful than that, because there's a deeper spiritual reality than just simply the work itself. But I do think we have these rhythms of the heart, and I found this to be true universally, that when I talk to people about, would you like to be involved in rescuing others, who says, no, I want everyone to rot? Other than maybe an American narcissist. Most people want to be, they just don't know how. They don't see any entry point into that kind of life. So that's why I think what he talks about in terms of what White talks about, the good, the true, and the beautiful, this is what N.T. Wright really expounds on in a way that I found really compelling. And he uses this idea, and where he talks about, I have to always think about this because I'll say pitchfork, and that's not what I mean, a tuning fork. Okay, it's a little different because a pitchfork grabs stuff you don't want to talk about. But a tuning fork, the church I grew up in, we had this bald-headed song leader, and he had a tuning fork, and he'd go, pong, and pop it on the side of his head. And I kept saying, hit your book or something, but he'd pong, and do-so-me, do-so-me, do. But if you have a tuning fork keyed to a C, and you hit it, and then you bring it close to another tuning fork that's also keyed to a C, what happens?
Vibrate.
They don't even have to touch. They start vibrating. And so what N.T. Wright says is what churches ought to be involved in is teaching people to vibrate the frequency of the echoes of the voice of Jesus. And that when you find yourself in close proximity to another, then that's ultimately what brings them to faith. I think besides the story of Max that I told you before, the person that I was able to bring to faith that was the furthest from it, if I told you this story, stop me, but I was working up in Highland. We were Illinois, and the church we planted there. We built our own building over a couple of weekends. It was really fun. But the way we did it, we negotiated with manufacturers and said they could use the building as a display of their product if they would give us a lower price on the product. And so we got all kinds of interesting products to use. And we needed a special kind of aluminum siding for this building that we were building. And we had reached through a school friendship, a family, that they were their background was Ukrainian, and they had been at some point in their background Orthodox Christians, but they had given up on it. And there was a lady and her 2 daughters started coming to church, and they were wonderful people. And we ended up baptizing the wife, but the husband, when I met him the first time, not before nor since have I been cussed out like I was. Because he was a pretty heavy drinker, had problems with alcoholism, and last thing he wanted was for his wife, as he said, to turn into some kind of religious freak. And he was really angry that his daughters found, they were part of our youth group and they really enjoyed it. And so he was spit mad. He scared me to death. And he was threatening me, and so it was not a good start. Well, we walk into this company and negotiate a settlement for the aluminum siding, and they said, well, we need to send out someone from our company to work with you putting up the siding because it can only be done by a licensed worker. And so I was going to be the guy in the bucket, and basically we were going up and down this wall and driving rivets, but it had to be supervised by one of their workers, and it was Greg Cotis. It was the guy who had cussed me out royally and was hateful, and I thought, this is either a really bad joke or, man, it was a week. We were going to spend a week in a bucket going up and down this wall. And he sort of looked at me with his wary eye, and I looked at him with a really scared eye because he was a big man. And it was such a neat experience. A week later, when we put the bucket down for the last time, we called his wife and his daughters, and we baptized them into Christ. A week in a bucket will change a life. And I thought over that many times. I don't know that there's any other way I would have ever been able to reach Greg. Because the first day in the bucket, there was more profanity than, anything that happened. He was mad at me, and, it was just, and the second day, and I was just determined to live the way of Jesus as best I could. And, we started telling stories, and he started telling stories, and I'm committed to this idea that when we have people prepared and we can put them in presence, in proximity, that even people who are belligerent to the message, hopefully something will ring true. And man, I'll never forget. I still have the tape out if you want to hear it. It's one of the most transformative messages I've ever heard. It's VHS, so that tells you how long ago this was. But the first time he gave a talk at the Lord's table, it was powerful. Because he was reflecting back as a child, being an accolade in the Orthodox Church, gathering at the table, overwhelmed by the mystery of the table. And he says, now I've met the risen Lord. It's a different experience. He says, now there was amazement there. And so, when you're around that kind of coming to life, that really does make all the difference. So I should show this if we were going to visualize everything. I just don't have time. But August Rush, anybody? Fan?
Love it.
Love it. Okay, it's like my favorite movie. I'm a gushy man. For me, film is an escape. I don't want anything real. I want animated or August Rush. So if you haven't seen the movie, go see it. I promise you'll feel good when it's over. But it's this little boy who is separated from his parents at birth. It's a little bit of a tragic story, but it ends well. But he has this music in his head. And in this really cool scene, he's directing the wheat and with the wind blowing through the field. It's just... All right, I'm going to try it. No, I don't have sound. I can't. Never mind. I'll have to go back. Sorry. I was going to show the slide, but maybe another time. Go back down. All right. So finally, he runs away from the orphanage. He has this song in his mind. He just keeps wanting somehow to express it. He has no way to express it. He finds a guitar, and he retunes it to the tune he hears in his head. And you can look this up on YouTube, by the way. Look it up. Just look up August Rush Slam or Guitar Slam. And he starts slamming on the strings and figures out how to make music, and he can finally express the song he's always heard. That's about as good analogy as I can find about the gospel being the instrument that brings a song in your heart alive. And I think the world has a song. A lot of people have shut it down, but it's there. And if you can get deep enough to give them the instrument of the gospel, which lets them play the song of their life, I've seen it over and over again. People come alive. And again, what I would say, my own personal opinion is, it's really difficult to do that from the pulpit. You can prepare people, but it takes, I think, proximity. But I've seen it happen enough in my life, and I see it happen with my students now. I mean, I had a discussion with a student the other day, and it's too beautiful to not be compelled to keep telling the story. Where you see a whole different person because the message is transformative. When they hear that their life has something to do with the creator of the universe, and it's just fun. I mean, I had a student the other day, we were talking about this, and he's grown up his entire life in the church. He has all these gifts, but no way to express them in the context of a church setting. And I said, well, why does it have to be a church setting? I mean, why can't you use your creative gifts to tell the story of Jesus in ways that the others, don't think about? We've limited this. So I want us to think about, what does it mean to live out the gospel in a way that we see this transforming power of grace and truth. And his treatment there, in that, I didn't sequence this page, so, he talks about, okay, here we go. We're going to talk about tools for diagnosis. So I had to get here today. I'm feeling better. That if we're going to effectively communicate the gospel, there's a couple of tools I'd like you to be aware of. Now, I'm a little bit afraid of talking about tools because we tend to use them. There may be better ones. But in terms of cultural evaluation, what I'd like to see you do on your second paper, and look, I'm not looking for specific content in terms of this has to be provable information. At this point in the course, you may be able to do not much more than anecdotal, but I still want you to do it. Meaning, answer these questions. And Steve talked to me the other day about saying, I don't know how to write a paper, and he's auditing, so he doesn't necessarily have to. But, what I would say is think about a group of people that you know who have maybe been entrapped by their own understanding of a limited gospel or no gospel at all. And what you're trying to do is to think up a missional strategy to reach them with the gospel. I'm just asking you to dream here. So some of you have already told me about your projects, and I'm pretty excited about them because I want them to be something meaningful to you. All right? The more this could be, and hey, I'm not suggesting you're going to do something that's going to change the world, but it might. And I told you, and we're going to have Rob Touchton come in one night and tell you about his experience, and not to promote this class. You're already here. I don't need to do that. It's that, is working through this. And he told me he had a choice on his project. He said, my wife and I have actually talked about someday going to Kenya. And I shut him down on that. I said, that's too traditional in terms of mission. And I said, you're dreaming about that as if that's something you may or may not do. Let yourself go and say, what would you do if you were going to change the community in which you live with the gospel message? And so that's how I came up with the idea of the well house and using that as a church launching mechanism. And I can't help but think that that's going to be something that's going to spread in ways. I'm excited about the possibility. He's already influenced some people from as far away as Australia with the possibility. And then now he's working here as professor of business entrepreneurship and just saying, hey, how can we do this? So what I'm asking you to do is to figure out a group of people. Think of somebody or a particular subset. I think, True, you've talked about young African-American boys in sports. So there you've got a group. And what you want to do then, first of all, is learn the language. And it's important here. I'm talking about heart language. Now, by the way, these are missionary tasks. So we don't generally think about using these in our culture. Well, if you've not heard anything else from James White, no, we are in a mission context. And part of it is learning the language. And when I say heart language, what I'm talking about is the language that is spoken, that it's an expression of the heart. And language is more, by the way, than just words, right? And this is the way people communicate. And you've got to be able to communicate the gospel in a way that can be understood. In the area of Italy where Rebecca and I worked for years, Italian is the official language. Friulan is the heart language. And Friulan is only spoken in a couple of places in the world. And it's not a dialect, it's a language. It has a different alphabet. It's a combination of German, French, and Italian. And in that area of Friuli, we could speak Italian to them, and they would understand. But it didn't really resonate with their heart. So it was through learning Friulan that made the real difference. And I didn't have to be able to speak it fluently, but I could understand it. So that when they would speak and I'd come back and answer them, they lost their secret message language where they thought they could speak without me understanding. I had a good friend who worked for the church, who works for the church in Malta, and their official language is English, but their heart language is Maltese. And he is Maltese, so he could speak it. But he said that the difficulty of American missionaries was that they would come and think that they could connect to the heart without learning the language. And that just doesn't work. Okay, I don't think it works in our culture either. So understanding this means that you understand how a particular culture works. So learn the language means more than just the right phrase, the right phrases. It means that you understand how they think and how they express their ideas. That also keeps you from misunderstanding what they're trying to say to you, right? So we got that, right? Good? All right, then become a student of the culture. And that is, and this is where I add this in, learn the story. Now, I've done research here, and I think the idea of appreciative inquiry is really helpful, especially, I'm using this right now in the course that I teach in the Doctor of Ministry program here. In the class I teach is on congregational leadership. It's really missional leadership. But I think I've told you I have each of the individuals in that course use appreciative inquiry, which is asking questions which basically reveal the story of the church where they're working. And by that, what you're doing is understanding their culture. Every group has a particular culture. And until you understand it, you're not going to be able to effectively translate the gospel into that culture. And so how extensive does this have to be? Well, you're writing a paper for a master's level class. I'm not asking for it to be significant research. I'm asking you to think through this. So what do you think the prevailing culture, and true, this would be interesting just to see. I mean, what do you think those young men are thinking about life? And some of it's not going to be very positive, right? And if they see themselves in a non-exit situation where, it's either this or I'm going to be selling drugs or whatever that is, I don't want to overcharacterize. I'm just saying you're trying to figure out what they think life is, and that's inevitably going to affect what they think it's going to be. And this is something that we have not understood well. We assume that people understand the gospel is going to free them. So we'll say, Jesus said you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, if you don't even have the ability to imagine what freedom looks like, how can you imagine it? You know what I'm saying? You've got to understand the story that they're living in before you can help them come out of it. And this has been really interesting research in terms of what I've done with this missional leadership class, is that generally preachers and ministers have been surprised at the prevailing story of their community. I call this lethal, it's sort of a lethal assumption that you understand how people think and what they expect. So ask questions. Find out what their stories are. Does that make sense? Are we good there? Have I pounded that one enough?
Go a little further.
Okay.
Not meaning about to.
Talk to me about what you're thinking about doing.
Okay. Introducing into an established fellowship spiritual disciplines for the purpose of having a two-way relationship with the Holy Spirit.
Right. So you're asking, what you're trying to do, it seems to me, is you're trying to give them an avenue for transformative experience
Yes.
where that experience is not expected.
Yes.
Okay, so the story would be, I go to church. I need to find this out. What is it that's killing the spirituality of people where you're trying to introduce life? It's likely that they have a story that doesn't necessarily end well. People live up to their lowest expectations.
So they don't expect to hear from the Spirit.
No.
So why should they hear from the
That's a
Spirit?
waste of time.
So that might be a surprise. that
Absolutely.
they- Okay.
So, how do you expect them to embrace? Because I had this happen last week. I was down in southern Alabama talking to a group of teachers, and I got confronted by a person and I don't get upset by this. I'm used to it. But they asked me to talk about be still and flourish. And so there's some really great schools in southern Alabama, but there's some that are deeply traditional. And one school they didn't expect to show up showed up. And my good friend Ron Mitchell, who's the headmaster down at Prattville, sort of told me, he said, watch out, they're not going to. So I was careful with my language. But nonetheless, I had a lady come walk, and when they point from like 15 feet away, you know you're going to get it. Because she's coming at me, and she said, did you mean to say that the Holy Spirit speaks in other ways besides Scripture? And so I had been talking about calming one's soul. I mean, I didn't tell them it was Richard Rohr, but I led them through the experience of, do you know this experience? I really like it in terms of a contemplative experience. It's where he says, recite with me, be still and know that I am God. So say that after me, okay? Be still and know that I am God.
Be still and know that I am God.
Be still and know that I am.
Be still and know that I am.
Be still and know.
Be still and know.
Be still.
Be still.
Be. If you ever get excited and your blood pressure goes up, walk through that. I promise you, your blood pressure will drop because you recognize a profound story that you believe to be true in every aspect of that. And so she was really uncomfortable that I'd led them through that experience because she said, I think that means that you think God speaks to us. And I said, I certainly do. Oh, it was a shudder. I said, now I don't think it's necessarily, and I understand what I'm saying here, it's not apart from the Word. I think your mind has to be trained in the Word. But I said, have you ever found yourself in conversation with someone when you said something that was more profound than what you thought you knew, and it came from Scripture? And she paused and went, yeah. And I said, and that's not God speaking to you? Through Scripture. I said, I'm not arguing. But there's just certain language, right? So her story, she basically, technically she lived in a closed metaphysic, meaning she did not believe that God intervened in any particular way. So people aren't going to live above that expectation. So teaching them a practice doesn't mean that they're going to get it. So you've got to open up a new reality. So that ought to affect your strategy. Because if they have a story that they don't expect those results, then you've got to open up that possibility in some way. By using language appropriate to where they are, right? Because that's what we're talking about next. Translate the gospel. Tell the better story. And then I appreciate this. He talks about the difference between what I would call faithful translation and unfaithful conforming. He actually calls that transformation. I don't like using the word that way. He says, translate the gospel, don't transform it. So he's using the word transformation in a negative way, which I think is probably not a good idea. I would use another word. I would say it's unfaithful conformity to the culture that distorts it. Can
I give you another kind of thing
Sure.
like you did?
Sure.
I'm dealing with high school students, of course, and it's hard to put it in words. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to change the way they think, and the stuff we talked about in here, because a lot of them have been so trained in the legalism and their ideas of things like chapel and things like that are so ingrained in them from the previous generation. And what I'm going to be trying to do is change the way they think in terms of it is about relationships. It is about restoration and these things. So where does that fit into this model that you're talking about, or does it?
No, I think it does. Again, what you're trying to do is, first of all, when you say learn the language, you understand that. You've been there. And this is the big, the best thing about this lady coming at me, I knew what she was going to say before she said it. I've been there. I mean, I would have been exactly where she was, hopefully, a few years ago. But, so it helped me understand her language. And I knew the culture out of which she was coming. Because, I've often said if 10 years ago I knew myself now, I wouldn't like me at all. And so I understand why this is threatening. And so what I want to try to do then is translate the gospel, meaning I think the appropriate way of translating the gospel, tell the better story, is you appreciate where a person is and give them a sense that there might be something more. And so when you're trying to take them from that rigid view of Scripture, just say, I'm not denying the truth of that. I just think that when I like the way N.T. Wright said this. I may have told you about this before, but he talks about propositional truth as being absolutely necessary to sustaining a story. The problem in the past is we've had propositional truth that's been presented disproportionately, so that you have bullet points that ultimately don't lead anywhere. There's no livable narrative. So you say, I believe this, 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 and this. Now get out of my way. I don't have time for you. They've said all the right things. They've cited the creed. Or we don't believe in creed, but they've cited the accepted doctrine of 5 steps of salvation, but there's nothing of them that looks like Jesus, right? So what N.T. Wright says is what story does, when appropriately used, is it lets the propositional truths come alive in the context of real life. Ultimately, it's like connecting the dots, and guess what? There's Jesus. So you're appreciating. This translating is appreciating the journey. And by the way, even in heathen nations, the missional principle here is there are almost always redemptive analogies in every culture. And you look for points of connectedness and then reinterpret those. I'm working right now with a student in a class that's Hindu, and she's committed to, but we're starting to have some conversations that I don't think we could have had I not understood the idea of where she's coming from and what she finds so challenging. See, with the Hindu, there's the issue is not, do you believe in God? It's being specific about who that God is. But what you find out is all the attributes that they believe in that leads them to causes that might look very much like a Christian cause, they have no unifying principle. And so that, it doesn't lead to any kind of a sense of relationship at all. You don't relate to the gods. You simply honor them by your behaviors. And so understanding that then is helping them recognize that, yes, what you believe, and in the language here you have to be very careful with, is partially true. But I think I can tell you a better story that will pull all of your experience of life into a more meaningful understanding. Does that help, Karen?
Mm-hmm.
You can say no.
No, it does.
Okay.
I may have to have more help, as I think.
Well, people will not go beyond their expectations unless you give them a reason to. And it can't be haunting or threatening. It has to be I think it has to be a natural deepening of that which is already there. So that's even, I had a discussion with my father not too long before he died. And he was a great spiritual hero, but we obviously had some pretty significant differences in terms of understanding the nature of the kingdom of God. And I think one of the most significant moments I had with him toward the end of his life was a discussion that we had where I said, Dad, I hope you understand I'm standing on your shoulders. I'm not pushing you away. And he understood that. And so, it's not that we're negating who we've been. It's recognizing that there's a deeper reality, that there's, it's, and I need to attribute this story because I don't remember what book I read it in, but he talks about the difference between snorkeling at the Great Reef and being a certified scuba diver where you can go into the depths. From the surface you can see the beauty, but you have no idea of its beauty until you can swim the depths. And so this is what we're trying to do, is to take people who, instead of, and the old way used to be you had to flatten that person's spirituality and show them how wrong that was, and then tell them what they needed to do to get it right. And you were the right one and they were the wrong one, and that's just not helpful. Does that help? Okay, we don't have time to read this, but I think Golly's quote, I met Mark a couple of months ago. He's a neat guy. He's the editor of Christianity Today. And his discussion there and we talked about the grace and truth rubric already, but obviously what we're trying to do is bring grace and truth together. Okay, now, this is the last presentation. I don't know that I'm going to get all the way through this because we've got about 15 minutes. I think I might be able to do this. But this idea of a Christian mind, I just got a book this week that I'm going to be reading that talks about the transformative potential of the brain in terms of how it works. There's some new research being done. By the way, Larry Bridgesmith has helped me with this. We're working together on a research project on this. But there are actually ways of re-channeling the paths of the brain, and in terms of changing habitual behaviors even. But that's only going to happen when we find ourselves committed to this transformative power of the Spirit of God. And one of the things that I really appreciate James White emphasizing is this really, I told you my favorite word these days is robust. Robust, right? This robust theology, it can sustain the weight of the complexity of life. Now, here's the argument I often hear. So you think you have to be some kind of scholar to defend the gospel? No, but I think those of you who have been called to scholarship have an essential calling to do such. I think the message of Jesus is simple. I think some of the people who I think best embody the message are some of the people that I know of that have not been past third grade. I can tell you 3 or 4 heroes in my life that I met in Italy. They're illiterate. But man, did they live the ways of Jesus. However, while intellect and being sharp intellectually is not necessary to embody the gospel, those of us who choose the way of the academic world, we're responsible to be able to defend the faith against anyone who might bring up opposition to it. So a conviction of the mind is equally vital to a confident living out of the ways of Jesus. So Romans 12, what's it say? Do not conform to the world, but be transformed by renewing of the mind. That's pretty specific. Because Paul can use the mind, body, and soul stuff, heart, mind, and soul. Here he says it's the renewing of the mind that leads to faithful Christian living, so that you are convinced, and that word has a double meaning, by the way, that you give evidence, not just to yourself, but you show the world that the Word of God is good and holy and perfect. But it calls for a renewing of the mind, so you have to be deeply convinced of this. And so this is where James White made me very happy. He said worldview is a fundamental concept here. And I do think this is a really important idea, that faithful contextualization can only occur through an equipped mind. Meaning, if we're going to be the ones who translate the message, and don't misunderstand this, I'm not saying that everyone has to be a scholar. But those of you who have chosen to be, this is where I think James talks about take seriously your calling to be a teacher. It's not something to be taken lightly. You will be held responsible. So there. All right. Integrated life, missional imagination. It's got to become a natural part of who we are, where everything about our life, and I'm not suggesting that I'm there yet, but I do think I'm moving in that direction. Steve and I have journeyed together long enough that I've seen in him amazing movement. I hope he's seen that in me. And there's nothing easy about this. It's just hard work. Is it God's grace? Absolutely. Don't misunderstand me here. It's grace and truth working together. But if we're going to take this seriously, we'll recognize we will have work to do until we die. And that's actually good news, because that gives our life meaning. So the classic apologetics no longer work, because, as we've talked about this already in class, we can give our very best shot and people go, that doesn't mean anything to me. So if we don't have an integrated life that helps us develop this missional imagination, where we can actually help others think and imagine. I'm reading a book right now called Imagination Redeemed. Did I tell you about this? I don't remember what we talked about. It's a bit weird. Okay. Imagination Redeemed, I recommend it. It's actually a treatment of Ezekiel, which I wouldn't have thought of. But there's a teacher of literature who's sitting and hearing a sermon on Ezekiel. And it so sparks his imagination that he goes to the one who presented the message, who's a student of theology, and said, let's write a book. And so they did. But what he talks about is, in Ezekiel, you have all these visions, right? And part of the visions is actually the throne room of God and the wheel within the wheel. And then you have the valley of the dry bones anyway. But he uses that to say, what do you use your fantasy life for? Think about the potential of training your mind to think about the majesty of God whenever it goes into default. And think about what Satan wants you to think about that just leaves you frustrated and empty. He said, redeem your imagination and think about what... And so this is one of the things I'm having a lot of fun with now, is especially if I have a problematic student. I try to think about what their life might be like if they could catch the missional imagination and how even the hurt in their life could be transformed. That's I told you about the woman that was in the Jesus Master Teacher class, and seeing that happen time and time again, where their stories are rewritten because they're given the opportunity to see Jesus in new light. So that's what I mean by missional imagination. So James Sire, who's one of my favorite writers, he's an interesting fellow, and I wish I could tell you more about him, but we're running out of time. But he's written a lot of books. In particular, he wrote the book called The Universe Next Door, which is the best-selling book on worldview, especially Christian worldview. It's been used now through, 4 or 5 editions. But it's basically the text that talks about Christian worldview that's accepted even by secular universities. And so, but he's also written extensively on apologetics. And his latest book I'm using in my faith and culture class, and it's called Apologetics Beyond Reason. And it's really interesting. I'll share more about that later in the semester. Because what he's talking about is reason doesn't necessarily work now with the postmodern mind. I know that drives some of you crazy. But we can have more arrows in our quiver than just rationality. That doesn't mean that still can't work, that you can reason through faith. But what he talks about, and he tells some compelling stories in the book, and here is an apologist. I mean, he spent his life writing texts on how to do apologetics. But he is also the one who I think has the best definition of worldview. So listen to how this functions. A worldview is a commitment. By the way, I will publish these slides, so if you don't write this down, you can get it later. A fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of propositions, assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false. There are a lot of presuppositions that we embrace without exploring, which we hold consistently or inconsistently about the basic constitution of reality. And that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. That sounds a lot like how culture functions. But what I want you to see is that also sounds like, to me, a working definition of faith. So some of the research I'm doing right now is I'm trying to establish that faith and worldview function as functional equivalents, meaning your faith is actually the way you see the world. It's not what you say it is. It's what you value and how you act. So it's your faith is actually the way that you see the world around you, and that's going to determine your behavior. So I think worldview has some real value because it talks to us about behavioral ideas that because our minds are not fully convinced of the story of Jesus, we live in ways that are often defeating of his purpose. So when we ask the question, what's the real story? I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the question of what story do I find myself a part, or Newbegin, who is sort of the champion of this idea of narrative theology. The way we understand the human life depends on what conception we have of the human story. What is the real story of which my life is a part? So Karen, let me go back to your question again. This is what we're trying to find out in evaluating the culture in which a person lives. Because everybody has a story that they believe they're participating in. And the way you understand that story is ask them what they value most. That's a tricky question. Because if you ask it in a religious environment, they're not about to say money. But if that's where they're spending all their time and their effort, even though they don't admit it, it's clear that that's what they're pursuing. And in that case, if your primary pursuit is earthly wealth, you may not want to hear the voice of God. And so we're trying to come to understand what is a person's reality. And so this idea of the communal nature of worldview this is what I've been exploring with this D-Min class, is what is the story of your community? That people live up to the expected behavior of a particular community. So we've talked about this before. Most people think about church in terms of primary responsibilities. What do?
Show up on
Show up.
and give money.
And give money. And stay out of big trouble. And that's the expectation level. So, issues in communal way of life. What that means is, look how a community functions. If it's peace and deep love for one another, that's the story in which they've been called to live. If you're constantly working at managing conflicts, that is telling you that they're not living in the story to which they've been invited. True?
I find sometimes that as in that community that sometimes we create on learning how to hide too.
Yeah, sure.
You know, so instead of just being yourself or just being like, I'm not going to put any pressure on myself. Life's already hard, so I'd rather just be honest about my faults. And of course, there's going to be people who aren't going to be able to take that and they're going to gossip, but I'm going to be comfortable with myself to know that I'm not going to be held prisoner by trying to placate. We be honest because Jesus Christ died for this, so we do a good job of putting on costumes.
Yeah, we do. And one of the things that Randy Harris says, and I attribute this to Randy Harris, so if you don't like it, it's his fault. But he says that a lot of the practices, and Karen, this comes back to a question you asked too, a lot of the practices in our churches are specifically designed to keep us from having the kind of relationship that you're currently trying to see. In other words, we have impersonalized faith and actually put our stamp of approval on that impersonal faith because then we don't have to get real. And so when you look at a church and you recognize what that community is espousing in terms of how they interact with one another, that tells you the story by which that church functions. Now, I'm guessing that some of you, like me, have had the wonderful opportunity of being at least a part for a temporary time of a missional church where people really love each other. And they can't wait to be together. And it's just a different experience. They're not going to fight. They couldn't. They're a real family. And so, what story do they tell? And so it shapes and unifies communal life. It's socialized into the communal way of life. And often this is unconscious. And that's why you're asking the question, what's the true story that you live in? So what story does your faith community live in? Look at the way people live and interact with one another. And this is, Lanny, this is one of the things that I'm challenging Christian educators to think about. That Christian schools can't be Christian schools if the environment by which they function. And I'll tell you, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge with educators who, especially educators, and this is not true in your case, but I've seen this. Power works to control, and it works pretty efficiently. But the outcome is often destructive. And so I know administrators who will use coercive power even against their own teachers. And then wonder why they don't have a loving community. And when you use coercive power, you can't have loving community. That's also true in churches, where leaders continue to threaten instead of invite and allow people to talk about their problems, right? Mm-hmm. So you create this environment that is actually antithetical to the very gospel you're trying to preach. Okay, so these worldviews shape the whole of our lives. They shape the way that we see the world, the way we interpret the world, the way we live in the world and interact with one another. So we act out of our basic beliefs. And memory learning is not the same as thinking learning. And so part of what we're talking about is how do we discover how people behave so that we can understand the true story that drives their life. So, like, I'm going to give you a test on this. You're going to have to identify each of the parts of the brain. But this is what neuroscience is now teaching us that we did not previously understand, is in the frontal lobe, this is where you do your thinking, right? But you act out of your parental and then your temporal lobe. That's where your behaviors come from. So that in a moment of crisis, you act out of what's deeply embedded in your mind, not what you're thinking. That's why what would Jesus do doesn't work. You don't think through that. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, where you know better and then you behave in a certain way, and you hear people will often say, I don't know why I did that. That's just not me. Okay, bad news. It is you. That's why you acted that way. You act out your true beliefs. You may think differently, but you act out of your worldview, the way you really see the world. So what I would suggest we're offering the world is a conversion that goes deep within the mind, But it doesn't get there without habitual practice. And it takes a while. This is what I think, Karen, the spiritual disciplines do. They move our reactions from the frontal lobe to the habitual lobe, where it becomes expression. So that, I love the way Dallas Willard says this, you dedicate yourself to the practices that allow you to do what Jesus did by nature instead of by I gotta love my enemy. It's like when my dad used to make us make up as a family. I'm one of 6 siblings. I'm number 5. And the one's closest to me is my sister Nancy. And I would constantly fight with her. She didn't want to fight, but I fought anyway. And then Dad would say, make up, kiss your sister. I'll get you later, right? You can't force love. It's got to be deeply embedded before it can be truly expressed. Now, real quickly, I think the way you evaluate worldview, and this may help you in terms of cultural evaluation. If you want to ask the question of story, there are certain elements to worldview that are help us understand how people think. And I'll post these so you can read the descriptions. I'm just going to quickly review them because we're out of time. But question of prime reality is the same thing as, do you believe in God or not? All worldviews begin with a fundamental understanding of whether God exists or not. Okay, this is the only element of worldview that is you can classify as primary. The other ones follow each other in no particular sequential order. But everyone's view of the world is deeply affected by whether they believe in God or not, obviously, right? But there's more to it than that. It's not just prime reality, meaning do you believe that God is at the basis of reality? But what kind of God do you believe in? And that one you need to unpack. And you'll find out that a lot of people who say they believe in God, when you come to understand the nature of the God in whom they believe, and it generally is because of past pain, that they have a different understanding of God than perhaps they should. And so it's also a question of ontology, just meaning ultimately what do you think is the true state of things? And that's going to be dependent on what you see as being primary reality. So, you can't go up to someone and say, what's your view of what's your prime reality? That'll end the discussion pretty quickly. But I think you can at least analyze who they believe God is, and you ask them the question. What's your view of God? How do you believe He interacts with the world? Metaphysics is really important because that's the extent to which we believe something outside of the physical world interacts with us. Now, you talk about Aristotelian metaphysics, it's really complex. But metaphysics is just simply a question of, does God intervene in our lives or not? And to what extent does He intervene? Because I would say that my father, for the most of his life, had a wonderful view, a magnificent view and description of God, but he lived in a closed world. God was a distant God who did not necessarily interact. And so, later in his life, I think he understood. But the church I grew up in very much lived in a closed metaphysics, meaning you believed in God, but He did not interact in your life. And that has devastating consequences, right? So why pray?
Out of obedience.
Out of obedience. That's right. We have the example. But it doesn't really mean anything, right? Anthropology. This is huge. What is your view of humankind in terms of its capacity? Is it good? And is it basically good with needing a little bit of help from God, or are we totally depraved and totally depend on God's grace? Well, understanding. Now, this is where, if you're talking to a person in a culture different from your own, this can be widely variant. But one of the things I want to talk about is the image of God idea is the greatest story in terms of anthropology that exists in human history. This tells us about the possibility of humankind. It's a different way. If you can see within yourself the image of God, everything changes. Eschatology, this one we talked about in class, and we're going to talk more about this, so I'm just saying this is one of the most important elements of the way you view the world. What's going to happen in the end of things. And I'm going to also include here the idea of human history, which in most understandings of worldview, this is a separate category. But the idea is history moving towards something or not? Especially in our culture, where we don't believe in any kind of story, the postmodern world, we're not going anywhere. That gives you no place in the world. But if we're working toward a new heavens and new earth, that changes everything. That also means that everything that I do, we talked about that in a class that Steve's in on Sunday with me, talking about the bodily resurrection. If we live in the hope, and that, Paul says at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, that if you believe this, then you recognize there's nothing that you do in the name of Jesus that doesn't have eternal meaning. If you live in that story, it's going to change the way you live your life, right? So we'll talk more about that. Epistemology, and this is important in this context, because I can ask you the question, why are you learning? Epistemology is just your view of knowledge and your understanding of knowledge. And also, it also involves what is ultimately true. And so why do you want to know more? Well, one of the things I'm working on, I talked to a group of Chinese parents who were here on campus the other day. And they're not believers. And they want to know, what's this Christian stuff about, right? And so I was going to talk to the group, and I had a chance just to talk to a couple of the parents, but I've talked about this in China as well. There's the province of Yunnan, I talked to the deputy chief of education, and he just said, it seems to us sort of silly that you would have a university that's Christian, because faith is antithetical to reason. And then he said, why would you want to believe in God when you can believe in yourself? And I said, well, because I can't believe in myself. And he was perplexed by that. But what I told him, I said, look, you ought to be glad to send your students to us, and you ought to be glad to have us teach, because what we believe is that God created us for the sake of making the world a better place. I think this is the higher motivator for learning. To which he said, by the way, oh man, he said the only motivation we have for learning is it makes your life better, and hopefully it makes the mother country better. But he said that doesn't seem to inspire. Well, here's a better story. You learn because God gave you the capacity to learn so that you can ultimately serve Him. All right, and then ethics, okay. Why do we do what we do? It's based on our worldview. And this one's really interesting. When you look at some of the latest surveys, Christians fail the ethics test at a lower rate than non-believers. And some would suggest it's because we believe in grace so we can get away with it. And what I would propose is a missional ethic, which is we're either advancing the cause of Christ or we are defeating it by the decisions that we make. So that's something to talk about. And then this one, we'll end with this, your personal vision. If you could have everything that you want in life, what would it look like? If you could have the ideal life. And this often exposes, when I ask this question in the context of a church community, it's really interesting to see what happens. Because they know that when you talk about worldview, you're supposed to answer the questions correctly. And so you love Jesus, you love God, your purpose for life is to serve Him, and then when you unpack this vision, it's the American dream, which is not evil. It's just not what life could be. It could be so much more.
That's
So
a story that we're living by that we don't even know we're living by.
that's right. So that's what worldview does to you, though. It sets the trajectory of your life. So I just wonder, in our churches, how many people would actually identify being more like Jesus as being the primary purpose of their life? Now, they might know to say that, but then look how they spend their time and look how they spend their money and look how they interact with others, and you quickly find out they're living in a different story. So here's what we're trying to unpack, and we'll continue this discussion next week. As you come to understand where a person is living, how can you help them recognize there might be a better story? So what I think this does, I'm asking you to think about this. If you're going to do a missional strategy, then obviously you're not trying to just get people to church. You're trying to introduce them to a whole new way of life. And then what makes it a missional strategy is not that you're doing good. I mean, you can't leave Jesus out of the equation. I think these causes that we get involved in, people understand that this is the redemptive message of Jesus, but they see it as good being done just in good in and of itself. Introducing someone to Jesus gives them a reason that no other story can give them. I think here we go. That's what gives them a robust reason, because it has real content to it. It's not just the broth. It's got meat. There's something there that will sustain you. So I look forward to our continued conversation. Hope that was helpful. Look forward to continuing this next week.